She had not planned to be here this long. The hotel bar was meant to be a temporary refuge, a quiet pocket of dim light and low music where she could breathe before returning upstairs to smiles that required effort. The wedding reception above pulsed with joy that felt distant to her, laughter echoing off marble walls, champagne flutes clinking in celebration. She sat at the far end of the bar with her back straight, fingers loosely wrapped around a glass she hadn't finished, watching reflections shimmer across polished wood. This was her skill, she thought, being present without being noticed, useful without being chosen. Her name was Elena, and she had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. She was the dependable friend, the one who showed up early, stayed late, fixed problems quietly, and never demanded more than she was offered. Tonight was no different. She had flown in for the wedding, worn the dress that was elegant but unremarkable, smiled at the right moments, answered polite questions about work and life with practiced neutrality. Somewhere along the way, the exhaustion crept in. Not the kind sleep could fix, but the deeper kind, the kind that came from years of being strong without being seen. She took a slow sip of her drink and let her shoulders relax just slightly. The bartender glanced her way, checking in without intruding. She nodded her thanks. Around her the bar hummed softly. Couples leaned close, murmuring private jokes. A few guests from the wedding drifted in, flushed with alcohol and happiness, their conversations loud and carefree. Elena felt like an observer in someone else's story. She told herself that was fine. She had long since stopped expecting to be the center of anything. That was when the air beside her shifted. She sensed it before she saw it, a subtle change like the room had adjusted its attention. A woman took the stool next to hers with graceful certainty. No hesitation, no apology. Elena turned, reflexively polite, and paused. The woman was striking in a way that had nothing to do with beauty alone. Her posture was immaculate, her expression composed, her presence commanding. Silver threaded through her dark hair, swept back into a low, elegant style. She wore pearls that looked old and meaningful, not decorative. This was a woman accustomed to being obeyed without raising her voice. For a moment they sat in silence. The woman faced forward, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes fixed on the bar mirror as if assessing not her reflection but the room behind it. Elena wondered if she should speak, but something told her to wait. "You must forgive me," the woman said finally, her voice low and controlled, Italian accented and smooth. "I would not disturb you if it were not necessary." Elena blinked, surprised. "I'm sorry." The woman turned slightly now, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "I need your help." Before Elena could process the absurdity of that statement coming from someone like her, the woman leaned closer. Her perfume was subtle and expensive, carrying a faint note of citrus and something darker beneath it. When she spoke again, her words were barely above a whisper, but they landed with unmistakable weight. "Pretend you are my son's wife." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She laughed softly at first, a reflexive sound of disbelief. "I think you have the wrong person." The woman's hand closed around Elena's wrist, not tight, not threatening, but deliberate. Her fingers were warm, steady, grounding. "I do not," she said quietly. "Please listen to me." Elena's heart began to race. The world narrowed to that point of contact, to the seriousness in the woman's eyes. "Your son," the woman continued, still calm, "is being pressured into an alliance he does not want. There are men here tonight who believe a man without a family is a man without leverage. If they believe he is married, they will retreat. If they do not," she paused, choosing restraint over detail, "the consequences will be severe." Elena followed the woman's gaze without meaning to. Across the room, near the edge of the bar where shadows gathered, stood a man in a black suit. He was tall, broad-shouldered, utterly still amid the movement around him. He was not drinking, not speaking. His eyes scanned the room with controlled vigilance. There was nothing outwardly aggressive about him, yet something in his presence suggested quiet violence, power held in check by discipline rather than fear. As if summoned by her attention, his gaze lifted. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Alina felt it like a physical sensation, a tightening in her chest she hadn't anticipated. His expression did not change, but something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or curiosity, or warning. "That's him," Alina whispered. "Yes," the woman said, "my son." Alina swallowed. "I don't know him." "That is precisely why this will work." Fear curled low in her stomach, sharp and instinctive. This was not a misunderstanding she could laugh off. She didn't know who these people were, but every instinct she had told her they were dangerous, powerful, unforgiving. "I don't belong in your world," she said quietly. The woman's grip softened. For the first time, something vulnerable flickered across her composed features. "Neither did I once." There were 1,000 reasons to stand up, to walk away, to refuse. Alina saw them all clearly. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something else. A strange pull. A sense that this moment mattered more than it should. That the choice she made here would echo far beyond this bar. She nodded. The woman exhaled, relief barely contained. "Thank you." Moments later, Alina found herself standing beside the man in black, her hand resting on his arm as introductions were made in low voices. He did not question it. He did not flinch. His hand settled at the small of her back with protective certainty, his touch firm, intimate, convincing. When he leaned down and murmured, "Stay close and let me speak," his voice was calm, controlled, and entirely unyielding. Alina realized, with a sudden clarity that made her breath catch, that this was no ordinary man, and this was no harmless lie. As they turned together to face the room, she felt the weight of unseen eyes, of expectations she did not understand. She had come here to disappear for a moment. Instead, she had stepped into the center of something dangerous and irrevocable. A lie spoken in a whisper over a quiet drink, already reshaping her life in ways she could not yet imagine. The first thing Alina noticed once she was no longer sitting alone was how quickly the room seemed to reorient itself around him. Conversations softened as they passed. Eyes lingered too long, then looked away. The laughter that floated from the wedding guests carried a different edge now, careful, measured. Her hand still rested on his arm, and only when she became aware of the subtle tension in her own fingers did she realize how tightly she was holding on. He guided her away from the bar without asking, steering them toward a quieter corner near tall windows draped in sheer ivory curtains. His movement was smooth, unhurried, yet unmistakably directive. Alina had the strange sensation of being both protected and contained, as though stepping into his orbit meant surrendering control whether she wanted to or not. "My name is Marco," he said under his breath, lips barely moving. "When we speak in public, you smile. When we are silent, you stay close. Do you understand?" She nodded, throat dry. "Yes." Good. That was all. No reassurance. No explanation. Yet the absence of both made her acutely aware that he was taking this seriously, far more seriously than a harmless pretense would require. His hand remained at her back as guests approached, offering congratulations she did not feel entitled to receive. She answered politely, smiled when prompted, nodded as if she belonged at his side. Every time someone looked at them too closely, his grip tightened just enough to remind her not to drift. It was disorienting how natural it felt. The way he angled his body to shield her from certain people. The way his gaze sharpened whenever a man lingered too long in their vicinity. The way he murmured her name occasionally, grounding her when the weight of the lie threatened to overwhelm her. Alina had spent her life being overlooked. Now she was being watched, assessed, measured, and it left her unsteady. They were barely alone for more than a minute at a time, but when the opportunity came, it arrived abruptly. A member of the wedding staff approached Marco with a hushed word, gesturing discreetly toward a corridor leading away from the reception hall. Marco inclined his head, then glanced down at Alina. "Come with me." The hallway was cooler, quieter, lined with gilded mirrors that reflected them as a pair she did not yet recognize. She caught sight of herself beside him and almost laughed at the contrast. He looked like someone carved from intention, sharp lines and restrained power. She looked like someone still catching up to her own courage. They stopped near a closed door marked private. For the first time since leaving the bar, Marco turned fully toward her. Up close, his eyes were darker than she expected, steady and searching, as though cataloging every flicker of uncertainty on her face. "My mother involved you without consent," he said flatly. "She asked," Alina replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I agreed." His gaze shifted, something like surprise passing through it before being carefully hidden. "You could have refused." "I know. Why didn't you?" The question lingered between them, heavier than it should have been. Alina hesitated, then answered honestly. Because she was afraid, and because it felt important. For a moment Marco said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly, tension easing from his shoulders just enough for her to notice. "This situation will not end tonight," he said. "The men my mother fears will not be satisfied with appearances alone. They will test this. They will watch you. They will expect consistency." Alina's heart stuttered. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said quietly, "that for now you stay with me." The words settled heavily in her chest. "Stay with me. Not just tonight, not just in this room. For how long?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "Until it is safe for you not to." She should have argued. She should have demanded details, boundaries, an exit plan. Instead, she found herself nodding again, as though some part of her had already accepted that retreat was no longer an option. Marco reached out then, brushing his thumb lightly over the inside of her wrist, the same place his mother had held moments earlier. The contact was brief, almost professional, but it sent a ripple through her she could not explain. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said. The certainty in his voice unsettled her more than fear would have. They returned to the reception together, more closely aligned now, their movements synchronized. When he introduced her again, his arm slid naturally around her waist, his fingers resting possessively at her hip. Alina felt the weight of eyes on them, of judgments being formed and filed away. The lie demanded more of her with every passing second. Later, when the music swelled and couples drifted toward the dance floor, Marco did not ask. He simply led her forward. His hand was warm in hers, his other settling between her shoulder blades, guiding her into a rhythm she followed instinctively. They moved together in silence, surrounded by romance that was supposed to be real, while theirs was built on necessity and danger. Yet as they swayed, Alina became acutely aware of how carefully he held her, how his breathing matched hers, how his focus never wavered. This was not a performance for him. This was a strategy, and she was now part of it. When the song ended, he leaned close enough for his words to brush her ear. "From this moment on," he said, "we do nothing separately." The implication tightened around her like a vow she had never intended to make. Morning arrived without ceremony, filtered through sheer curtains and the quiet hum of a city waking below. Alina lay still for several moments, staring at a ceiling that was not hers, listening to sounds she did not yet recognize as safe or dangerous. The bed beneath her was too large, the sheets too crisp, carrying a faint scent that she now associated with Marco without fully understanding why. She had not slept much. Every time she drifted off, her mind replayed the night before in fragments. The weight of his hand at her waist, the measured calm in his voice, the way eyes had followed them wherever they went. When she finally pushed herself upright, the room confirmed what she already knew. She had not been allowed to leave. A garment bag hung neatly by the wardrobe, filled with clothes that were not hers. Her phone rested on the bedside table, fully charged but with no new messages, no missed calls. As if her old life had paused politely while she stepped into someone else. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Alina," Marco's voice said from the other side. "Are you awake?" "Yes." He entered a moment later, dressed immaculately, as though the night had not touched him at all. He carried 2 cups of coffee, setting one down within her reach before stepping back, giving her space without retreating entirely. She noticed how deliberate he was with distance, as if constantly calculating how close was appropriate, how much would unsettle her. "We need to talk," he said. Her fingers curled around the warm porcelain. "I was hoping you'd say that." He took a seat across from her, resting his forearms on his knees. "What my mother asked of you was not temporary," he began, "and it was not safe. I need you to understand that before we go any further." Alina met his gaze. "You're part of something dangerous." "Yes." "You won't explain it." "Not yet." She exhaled slowly, disappointment threading through her despite her resolve not to expect more. "Then explain this," she said. "Why me?" Marco hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "Because you are unknown, unconnected, and because when you agreed, you did not ask what you would gain." "That's not an answer," she said quietly. "It's the only one I can give you for now." Silence settled between them, dense and unresolved. Alina realized then that he was as guarded emotionally as he was strategically. Every word was measured, every admission rationed. And yet, beneath that control, she sensed a strain he could not fully conceal. They spent the day together because there was no alternative. Wherever Marco went, Alina went with him. Through private elevators, quiet corridors, sunlit terraces where men greeted him with deference and watched her with open curiosity. She learned quickly which questions not to ask and which glances to return with polite warmth. She learned that his hand on her back was not only possessive, but protective, a signal to others as much as to her. By afternoon, exhaustion tugged at her. Not physical, but emotional. The constant vigilance. The performance layered over uncertainty. When they finally found themselves alone again, standing on a balcony overlooking the city, Alina broke the silence. "You don't trust me," she said. Marco turned, surprised. "That isn't true." "You trust me to stand beside you," she replied, "but not to know you." His jaw tightened. "Knowing me would put you at risk." "So does standing next to you," she said, softer now. The wind lifted her hair, carrying with it the distant sounds of traffic and life continuing, unaware. Marco watched her for a long moment, something conflicted in his eyes. "You are not supposed to matter to me," he said finally. Her chest tightened. "But I do." The admission hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Marco stepped closer, close enough that Alina could feel the warmth of him, the restraint in every inch of his posture. His hand lifted, hesitated near her cheek, then fell back to his side. "This arrangement was meant to be strategic," he said quietly, "temporary. And now," he said, "it's becoming something I cannot fully control." That night, as they prepared to attend another family gathering, Alina caught sight of herself in the mirror, dressed in elegance she had not chosen, carrying a role she had not asked for. Yet when Marco stood behind her, adjusting a clasp at her neck with careful fingers, she felt a pull she could no longer deny. Someone knocked at the door, voices approaching, conversations halting abruptly outside. Marco's hand stilled. His eyes met hers in the mirror, a warning unspoken. "Alina," he murmured, "there are things about me you don't want to learn this way." Before she could ask what he meant, the door opened. The room filled too quickly, voices overlapping, tension sharpening the air as unfamiliar men stepped inside with practiced confidence. Alina felt it immediately, the shift from polite formality to something colder, something assessing. Marco moved without thinking, positioning himself slightly in front of her, his body a quiet barrier. Hands were shaken, greetings exchanged, but nothing felt casual. Every smile carried calculation. Every pause felt deliberate. Alina watched from behind his shoulder, absorbing fragments of conversation that made little sense yet carried undeniable weight. Alliances, expectations, obligations spoken in coded language. She realized then that she was not just a symbol to ward off danger. She was leverage, and the knowledge made her stomach twist. One of the men finally turned his attention fully to her. He was older, his eyes sharp and amused. "Your wife is very quiet," he said to Marco. "Beautiful, but quiet." Marco's hand settled at Alina's waist, firm. "She listens carefully," he replied. The man smiled thinly. "That is a valuable trait." Alina forced herself to meet his gaze, to hold it just long enough to appear unafraid. Inside, fear curled tighter. When the men finally left, the door closing behind them with a finality that echoed, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That was reckless," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Marco turned to her, surprise flickering into something harder. "They needed to see you." "They were evaluating me," she said, "like an object." "Yes," he replied without apology. The honesty stung more than a lie would have. "You said you wouldn't let anything happen to me." "I won't," he said. "But you're already letting this happen." Silence stretched between them, thick with unsaid truths. Marco's expression closed off, the softness she had glimpsed before disappearing behind control. "This is the reality of my life," he said. "If you cannot handle it, I will make arrangements for your departure." The words felt like a slap. "That's not what this is about," Alina said, her voice shaking despite her effort to steady it. "You don't get to decide what I can handle when you won't even tell me the truth. The truth would endanger you. Or you don't trust me enough to share it." Something dark passed through his eyes. "Trust is not a luxury I can afford." The finality in his tone fractured something inside her. She stepped back, creating distance where closeness had begun to feel natural. "Then stop pretending this is anything more than strategy," she said. Marco looked at her as if she'd wounded him, but he did not deny it. That night they attended the gathering separately. Not visibly, not to outsiders, but emotionally. Marco kept his distance, his hand no longer resting at her back, his touch restrained to what was strictly necessary. Alina felt the absence like a bruise. Every glance he didn't give her, every moment he chose conversation over connection, reinforced the realization she had been avoiding. Whatever she was beginning to feel, he would never allow himself to return it freely. Later, when the crowd thinned and the music softened, Alina slipped away to the terrace alone. The city stretched before her, lights glittering like promises she could not claim. She pressed her palms to the cool stone railing, breathing through the ache in her chest. She didn't hear Marco approach until his voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be alone." She turned, eyes bright. "You made that clear earlier." "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" He stopped a few feet away, as though an invisible line now separated them. "You're getting too close," he said quietly. "So are you," she replied. He shook his head. "I can't afford that." The words cut deeper than she expected. "Then you should never have asked me to stay." "I didn't ask," he said. "My mother did." "And you let her," Alina said, "because it suited you." Marco's jaw tightened. "Because it kept you alive." The anger drained from her, leaving only hurt. "I'm not afraid of the danger," she said softly. "I'm afraid of what you're asking me to give without offering anything in return." For a moment it looked as though he might reach for her. Instead, he stepped back. "This ends soon," he said, "for your sake." The dismissal settled heavily between them. Alina nodded, even as something inside her cracked. "Then don't worry," she said. "I won't make this harder for you." She walked past him without another word, each step feeling like a retreat from something she had only just begun to want. Behind her, Marco remained still, watching her go with an expression she did not see, one that mirrored the fracture spreading quietly through them both. Days passed, measured not by time but by absence. Alina remained in the same guarded luxury, yet everything felt hollow now. Conversations were brief. Instructions replaced warmth. Marco was always nearby, yet never truly with her. The space between them was invisible but absolute, a distance enforced not by walls but by choice. She told herself it was temporary, that this detachment was safer. Still, her body betrayed her in small, humiliating ways. She noticed the absence of his hand at her back before she noticed anything else. She listened for his voice in rooms where she already knew he would be. She caught herself glancing toward doors, half expecting him to appear and say something that would undo everything. He never did. At night, Alina lay awake, staring into darkness, replaying moments she had dismissed as insignificant at the time. The way he had steadied her without drawing attention. The way his voice softened when he spoke her name. The restraint he exercised even when tension thickened between them. She realized then that what unsettled her most was not the danger surrounding him, but the care he had shown while pretending he felt nothing at all. Across the same city, Marco stood alone in his office, the lights dimmed, the view outside reduced to cold geometry. He told himself this separation was necessary. That clarity required distance. Yet his thoughts betrayed him just as relentlessly. He remembered her fear not as weakness but as courage. He remembered the way she listened, the way she understood silence. Most of all, he remembered the moment on the terrace when he had stepped back instead of reaching for her, and how that restraint had felt like self-inflicted damage. "This is not what you planned," his mother said later, watching him from the doorway. "No," Marco replied. "And yet you persist." He said nothing. Alina learned more about the world she had stepped into without meaning to. Not through explanations, but through observation. She saw how power moved quietly, how loyalty was rewarded and betrayal remembered. She understood now why Marco guarded himself so fiercely. His life was a balance of obligation and control, and any misstep carried consequences far beyond himself. Knowing that did not ease the ache. It sharpened it. One afternoon, she overheard a conversation not meant for her. Two men speaking in low tones, dismissive and amused. "She's temporary," one said. "A convenient illusion." The words lodged painfully in her chest. That night, she packed her things with careful precision. Not because she was told to leave, but because she finally understood that staying meant surrendering pieces of herself she might never get back. When Marco found her by the door, bag at her feet, something in his expression shifted. "You're leaving," he said. "Yes. It isn't safe." "Neither is losing myself," she replied. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they had avoided saying. Marco took a step toward her, then stopped. Control reasserted itself. "I won't stop you," he said. The restraint hurt more than refusal would have. Alina nodded, lifting her bag. As she passed him, their hands brushed accidentally, the contact brief but electric. She felt it all the way down her spine. Hours later, Marco stood alone in the empty room she had left behind. The absence was immediate and absolute. He realized then, with a clarity that struck too late, that what he had been protecting himself from was not danger, but loss. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to admit the truth. He wanted her, not as strategy, not as protection, as choice. Marco did not sleep. He stood by the window as the city shifted from night into early morning, replaying every moment that had led him here. Control had always been his refuge, distance his armor. Yet the quiet Alina left behind had exposed how fragile that armor truly was. The world he ruled through discipline suddenly felt meaningless without her presence grounding it. When his phone finally rang, he answered without looking at it. His mother's voice came through, steady but edged with knowing. "You are losing her," she said. "I already have," Marco replied. "Then you are a fool," she said gently. "Because for the first time the danger was never loving someone, it was pretending you did not." The words struck with unerring precision. Marco ended the call and moved with decision he had been avoiding. He issued instructions, canceled meetings, delegated authority he rarely surrendered. For once, power would wait. Alina had not gone far. She sat in a quiet cafe near the edge of the city, a place where anonymity felt possible again. Her bag rested at her feet, untouched. She stared into her cup, wondering how something so brief could leave such a lasting ache. She told herself she had done the right thing, that walking away was an act of self-preservation. Still, the hollow space in her chest refused to be reasoned with. The sound of the door opening barely registered until his presence did. Elena looked up and felt her breath catch. Marco stood there, coat forgotten, eyes stripped of their usual restraint. For the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. He crossed the space between them without hesitation. People glanced up, sensing tension they could not name, then returned to their conversations. Marco stopped just short of her table, as though asking permission without words. "I was wrong," he said. The simplicity of the statement unraveled her. "About what?" "About everything that mattered," he said. "About believing control was strength. About thinking distance would protect us." His voice lowered. "About pretending you were replaceable." Elena stood slowly, heart pounding. "You don't get to say this now," she said. "Not after you let me walk away." "I let you go because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that loving you would make you a target. Afraid that choosing you would cost you your safety." "And you decided that alone," she said. "Yes," he said, "and it was arrogance disguised as protection." Silence pressed in around them. Marco reached into his jacket, withdrawing a small device and setting it on the table. "Everything I am," he said, "comes with danger. I won't lie to you about that, but I will never again decide for you." Her throat tightened. "What are you asking me?" "I am not asking," he said. "I am offering the truth." He met her eyes, unwavering. "I care for you in a way I have never allowed myself to care for anyone, not because you are useful, not because you are safe, but because you see me, even when I am trying to hide." The words settled slowly, painfully real. Elena searched his face for strategy, for manipulation, for the familiar armor. She found none. "If I stay," she said, voice barely steady, "this won't be pretending anymore." "I don't want it to be," he replied. "And you won't shut me out when it gets difficult." "I will try," he said honestly. The admission softened something inside her, not a promise of perfection but of effort, of choice. Marco stepped closer, close enough that the space between them felt charged. "Stay," he said quietly. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. "I won't be hidden," she said. "You will stand beside me," he said, "because you choose to." The city continued around them, indifferent and alive. Elena reached for his hand, fingers threading with his, the contact steady and deliberate. The choice was terrifying. It was also undeniable. The decision did not feel dramatic in the moment Elena made it. It felt quiet, heavy, real. She left the cafe with Marco beside her, not sheltered behind him, not pulled along by his momentum, but walking at an even pace, their hands linked with intention rather than necessity. For the first time since their paths had crossed, she felt neither trapped nor protected. She felt chosen. The days that followed unfolded differently from before. Not safer, not simpler, but more honest. Marco no longer positioned her as a symbol without explanation. He spoke to her in measured truths, careful but complete enough to honor her agency. She learned the shape of his world not as an outsider placed at his side, but as a partner allowed to see the cost of his authority. It was not glamorous. It was relentless. And yet, he never asked her to shrink herself within it. Their connection changed in subtle ways first. Conversations lingered longer. Silences became shared instead of guarded. When his hand rested at her back now, it was no longer a signal to others alone, but a grounding presence meant for her. At night, when they sat together in quiet rooms, the space between them felt intentional rather than restrained, a closeness built on consent rather than performance. One evening, as the city lights flickered on below them, Marco stopped mid-conversation and looked at her as if seeing her anew. "You know you can still walk away," he said. Elena met his gaze without hesitation. "I know." "That hasn't changed." "No," she said softly, "but neither has my choice." The words seemed to settle something in him. Marco reached for her then, not with urgency, but with reverence, his touch gentle, unhurried. When he kissed her, It was nothing like the controlled restraint she had grown used to. It was careful and present, a question asked rather than an assumption made. Alina answered without doubt, her hands finding his with equal certainty. There was no audience, no need to convince anyone, just the quiet acknowledgement of something earned through fear, distance, and truth. When they finally pulled back, Marco rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in as if anchoring himself. "I will fail sometimes," he said quietly. "So will I," she replied. The admission did not weaken what they had built, it strengthened it. From that moment on, they stood together not because danger demanded it, but because connection did. The world around them did not soften. Power still carried consequence, but within it, they carved out something fiercely private and deeply theirs. And when Alina later found herself once again in a crowded room filled with noise and expectation, she did not slip away this time. Marco was beside her, not as a shield, but as a presence that did not eclipse her own. What had begun as a lie now moved forward as something chosen, something alive, something worth the risk.